Chapter 3, The Return. The old mill stood silent against the backdrop of the sprawling fields, its weathered timbers a testament to years of neglect. Frank leaned against the hood of his truck, arms crossed, taking it all in. The mid-morning sun cast long shadows across the property, and a light breeze carried the scent of wild grass and faint memories. He hadn't been back to Willow Creek in over 20 years. Not since the summer everything fell apart. Frank hadn't always been a drifter. There was a time when life had been simple. He'd been just a kid, chasing fireflies in the evenings and fishing with his dad on lazy Sundays. His father, a big man with an even bigger laugh, had worked at the old mill back when it was still operational. The mill was the heart of the town then, providing steady jobs and a sense of community. But one stormy November night, everything changed. Frank had been 16 when his father died in a logging accident. A faulty chain snapped, and a massive log came loose, crushing him beneath its weight. Frank still remembered the somber knock on the door, the sheriff's hat in his hands as he delivered the news. His mother's wail cut through the silence like a blade, and for the first time in his life, Frank felt utterly powerless. His mother, a woman of quiet strength, made the difficult decision to leave Willow Creek. She packed up what little they had and moved them back to her hometown, 2 states away, where her parents still lived. Frank resented it at first, hated leaving behind the only life he'd ever known, but grief had a way of hollowing people out, and his mother needed the support. They stayed with his grandparents until Frank graduated high school. His grandfather, a no-nonsense man who believed in hard work and discipline, had a way of pulling Frank out of his darker moments. It was his grandfather who planted the idea of the Marines in Frank's head.
"Make something of yourself, boy,"
He'd said one afternoon, handing Frank a recruitment pamphlet.
"Your daddy would have wanted that."
And so Frank enlisted. The Marines shaped him, molded him into something he barely recognized. Over 2 decades of service had taken him to the far corners of the world, from desert combat zones to humanitarian missions in typhoon-ravaged villages. He'd seen the worst of humanity, and sometimes the best. But the years also left scars, both visible and not. By the time he retired, Frank had earned his share of stories, ones he rarely told. He was proud of his service, but the life had left him restless. Settling down wasn't in his nature, or at least, that's what he told himself. That restlessness had followed him when he got the call 6 months ago. His grandfather had passed, leaving him the family's 20-acre parcel in Willow Creek. The land and the old mill that came with it were now his. At first, Frank wasn't sure what to do with the inheritance. Memories of Willow Creek were buried deep, tangled with the ache of loss. But something about the idea of going back, of revisiting the place where it all began, tugged at him. Now standing here, he wasn't so sure he'd made the right choice. Frank exhaled deeply, his eyes scanning the property. The mill was a mess. Cracked windows, sagging beams, and vines creeping up its sides. But the land was something else. Rolling hills, a patch of woods, and a small creek winding its way through the property. He could see why his grandfather had held on to it. A distant sound caught his attention. The soft crunch of tires on gravel. He turned, his hand instinctively brushing the worn leather strap of his watch, a habit from years of carrying a sidearm. But the car passed by without slowing, its driver hidden behind the glare of the windshield. Frank relaxed, chuckling to himself. Old habits died hard. He ran a hand through his short cropped hair, streaked with a touch of gray that seemed to have appeared overnight. His wild streak hadn't completely dulled, though. His time in the service had left him with a taste for speed. He still owned a motorcycle that could outrun most cars, and an occasional itch for trouble. Back in town, Frank had already started making waves. He wasn't one for blending in. And small town life had a way of putting a spotlight on newcomers. At the general store, the cashier had been eager to strike up a conversation.
Back in town for good?
She'd asked, bagging his coffee and canned soup.
Something like that?
He'd replied, keeping it vague. He wasn't in the mood for the 20 questions routine, but he wasn't rude either. He knew how small towns worked. Word would spread no matter what he said. What he hadn't expected was how much the place still felt like home. The faces had changed, but the rhythms of Willow Creek hadn't. Kids still played in Grady's Park. The diner still smelled like bacon and fresh coffee, and the air, crisp and clean, felt like it could wash away years of chaos. Still, Frank couldn't help but wonder if his father would recognize the place now. Would he be proud of what Frank had become? Would he understand why it had taken so long to come back? Chapter 3, The Return. The old mill stood silent against the backdrop of the sprawling fields, its weathered timbers a testament to years of neglect. Frank leaned against the hood of his truck, arms crossed, taking it all in. The mid-morning sun cast long shadows across the property, and a light breeze carried the scent of wild grass and faint memories. He hadn't been back to Willow Creek in over 20 years. Not since the summer everything fell apart. Frank hadn't always been a drifter.